still can't hear you at the same time.
Check 1, 2.
How about now, Alex? Can you give us a talk there? No, not yet.
Can you not go direct into the PC and put a speakerphone up? Go direct into the PC. Would that work?
Don't know.
That's
But the problem.
it's like it's a clean Teams to me. Maybe hello, check, check. We can hear him.
It's their end.
But we're not hearing him.
Yeah, so I turned on the one Sennheiser, and then, but nothing. And the other one just won't even turn on. So it dropped 44% in about 2.5 hours.
Yeah, I know.
Although it ate through the first battery yesterday. So,
But they were plugged in overnight.
were they?
Yeah.
Then they weren't.
I unplugged at least one of them.
Yeah. But it must not have been plugged into an active socket.
Yeah. Do they light up green when they're off?
And
but
plugged in, I
charging?
think. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I'll double check this morning to make sure.
Okay. You mean this evening? Or tomorrow morning? Yeah. I'll double check this morning. So you're going to jump in a little blue box and go back in time now? You're Time Lord? Yeah.
Time lady.
Yeah. Sorry.
Check, 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 check. Okay.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Around. Yep.
You can hear us, eh, Alex? Okay, we can hear you. I think we're just gonna add a speaker to the PC and we'll be ready to go.
Bring a speaker. No. We had a power shutdown yesterday.
Right.
Lots of problems all over the place. And some switching thing has gone messed up. So we've worked it out so that the sound is, we can hear him from the computer. So for now, we'll just plug something to the computer and they'll hear us. Can you hear us? If you can show by a hand or something. Yeah.
Check 1, 2. Can you hear me, though? I don't know if that's important. Doesn't look like it. Yeah. I think it's the speaker on their end, though. Because, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, Alex.
Yes.
If you can hear me, this is Bob Hackett. I'm chairing this session. I thought what we would do is get started, and hopefully we'll be able to hear you by the time it's time for question and answer. That makes sense? No? That's not going to work?
I've been typing to them. Yeah. It's like there's... No.
Can you hear us at all, or is breaking up? You can hear us, yeah. So you can continue talking. It's just his speaker we'll fix later.
Well, can the audience hear us at Carleton? So why don't we get started, and then we'll during the course of our presentations, we should be able to fix it so that we can hear you before it's time for question and answer at the end.
Okay. As long as they know
Okay.
it's on their end. Yeah.
As long as you tell us when. Okay. Right, thank you. Well, greetings from Vancouver. This is a session on why democracy needs community media and why community media need policy support. We're speaking from Simon Fraser University, Vancouver campus, from the classroom of Professor Stuart Points, who's doing a course here on public sphere theory, and community media fits very much into that. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce the various speakers. I don't know if you can see visibly, but in any case, I'm Bob Hackett, a professor of communication here at SFU. I'm a co-founder of Media Democracy Days, and I've written 7 books on media and politics, and I'm going to be speaking to the importance of community media for democratic communication in light of market failure of corporate media. The second speaker will be Professor Stuart Points, an associate professor here at SFU, and a recent director and longtime contributor to our annual Media Democracy Day event. He has 2 books on youth culture and media education, and he's worked with community media groups for 2 decades, mainly in Vancouver. He's going to speak on the eruption of youth media in Canadian cities over the past decade and how that's contributed to a new ecology of community media and the prospects for this sector in the future. Our third speaker will be Daniel Ahadi, a doctoral candidate and soon-to-be lecturer here in the School of Communication at SFU. His research is on ethnic community media in diasporic communities, mainly North America and Europe, and focusing on a Swedish context. He'll speak on the role that a robust policy regime plays in shaping a sustainable community media infrastructure. Fourth speaker is David Christopher, the communications manager at Open Media, which is a citizens group that supports a free, democratic, and accessible internet. David is from Ireland, where he's worked in communications in New Zealand and the UK before moving to Vancouver, and he's going to speak to policy supports for community media, with particular relevance to internet policy. And finally, last but not least, will be Catherine Riley, an assistant professor in communication at SFU. He researches international and development communication. He works closely with the British Columbia Council for International Cooperation on their public engagement strategy, which builds the capacity of international civil society organizations to foster global citizenship values amongst Canadians. He'll talk on the need for policy support for community media in light of the landscape for public engagement in Canada. So if we're okay, if you can hear us, we'll get started. We have 12 minutes each, and I'm going to wave a flag when our speakers get to within a minute of the end. So we'll do these 5 presentations, and hopefully by then we'll be able to receive questions and comments from Carleton. So I'll start then with my own talk on why democracy needs community media. And I want to start with a story from Eric Kleinenberg in his book, Fighting for Air. It begins at 1:40 a.m. on January 18th, 2002, with a train derailment that sends a cloud of toxic gas drifting towards the small city of Minot, North Dakota. Minot's fire and rescue departments try to reach Clear Channel, which owns and operates all 6 commercial radio stations, to warn residents of the threat and to give them life-saving information. In other words, stay indoors. But the stations continue playing canned music, programmed from corporate headquarters in Texas. The only person in the stations had no idea what was going on. The people of Minot were taken unaware, and in fact, 1 died, and over 1,000 were injured because their radio system broke down, partly because the company that had established a monopoly over Minot's commercial stations had pulled valuable human resources out of the community, leaving no one available or alert enough to issue a warning when the public needed them most. The only radio station available actually was a non-commercial Christian one, which didn't have much of an audience. So that was a disaster. And it's just one, although admittedly extreme, example of the costs of what happens when you lose community and local radio. So my topic is, what are the distinct contributions to democracy of community radio and TV? And why are commercial and corporate media not likely to make those contributions? Well, as I'm sure you all know, community media broadcasting is officially recognized in the Broadcasting Act as one of 3 pillars of the broadcasting system. It fulfills democratic purposes that are not readily met by the other 2 sectors: private, commercial, usually corporate-owned broadcasters, and public broadcasters like CBC. But as you said in your website for this conference, through the participation of ordinary people and community organizations in production and their community-owned not-for-profit structure, community media can offer at least 6 things to democratic communication. Firstly, they offer a counterbalance to concentrated ownership of corporate media and to the bias of commercial broadcasting towards rating-driven programming that serves mainly the needs of advertisers. Secondly, they offer a democratic platform for free speech, including grassroots and local voices that are not often heard in conventional media. Thirdly, they can serve smaller populations that are not normally attractive to advertising-based media, including rural communities, urban neighborhoods, and other underserved groups and voices in cities. Fourthly, they can generate a greater variety of programming with more openness to experimentation rather than standardized formulas. Fifthly, opportunities to volunteers for training and practice in media production in the context of a supportive organization. And finally, they can develop relationships and accountability to a broader public. So in all these ways, developing skills, broadening relationships, and diversifying content, community media help to democratize both the media system and the broader society. But as you know, community media gets very little actual resource support, even though it's recognized in the Broadcasting Act as one of 3 pillars of the system. For over 30 years, we've had federal governments that worship at the altar of the market and read from the scriptures of neoliberalism, the doctrine that society should be governed by the logic of the market, of market relations, of individual exchanges through contracts, and the assumption that if unregulated, the private sector can serve whatever needs society has. I think it's very important in framing a new policy framework for community media to be clear on what's wrong with those assumptions. In a book called Remaking Media that I co-wrote with Bill Carroll, we suggest 8 key deficits, democratic deficits, of a corporate-dominated, market-driven media system. First, public sphere failure. For example, conglomerates' cutbacks in investment in journalism, commercial broadcasters' incentive to produce saleable audiences rather than genuine public forums. Secondly, the centralization of power. As I'm sure Leslie Shade and Dwayne Winsec have been talking about, there's too many media in too few hands. Several companies, just really 4 companies dominate Canada's media industries. Thirdly, inequality. We have the digital divide that you all know about. We have advertisers' bias towards affluent consumers rather than the rest of us. Fourthly, homogenization and similarity, not just of content, but of discourses, of consumerism and neoliberalism that is due not only to concentrated ownership, but to dominance of a single type of structure and ownership. Fifthly, the undermining of community, the so-called mean world syndrome, for example, that George Gerbner, the American communications scholar, used to talk about. We have media fare on TV drama, video games, I would argue, news, that cultivates perceptions of the world that exaggerates crime and violence, that turns strangers into enemies, that lowers the bar to authoritarian and militaristic approaches to social problems. We have a lack of investment in local programming, whether it's news or music. That's because the commercial incentive is to import mass market fare. So overall, the commercial media system does not always well serve the needs of communities. We also have a 6th problem, the corporate enclosure of knowledge, for example, through increasingly stringent copyright rules that are likely to get more stringent if the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal is passed. 7th, a problem of elitist and industry-oriented policymaking. Canada does have stronger traditions of public consultation than the US, but as you all know at this conference, community media has a difficult time getting a fair and adequate hearing through the CRTC. And finally, the erosion of communication rights like privacy, particularly in cyberspace, given the extent of state surveillance. So 8 key problems that we see that a corporate media system has vis-a-vis democratic communication, and we think that that system is not likely to remedy those deficits. And why is that? Because obviously their incentive and their mandate is to make profits and to serve shareholders. The outcomes of a market-driven system are not always consistent with the needs of democracy for pluralistic and an informed public sphere. So what I think we should argue is that corporate media is a case of market failure. It overproduces negative externalities. It's a term, of course, from neoclassical economic theory, conventional economic theory, that refers to the costs of market transactions that are not borne by the buyer or seller. So, for example, the impact of advertising to children on their socialization, or excessive amounts of violent or demeaning programming are examples of negative externalities in a commercial media system. Conversely, the flip side is that market-driven media underproduce certain positive externalities, that is, benefits to other people or society outside the buyers and sellers of the product. And those positive externalities would include well-informed publics and a strong sense of community. We all know that public education, for example, benefits everyone, even people who don't have kids in school. Another example in the media sphere would be great journalism. That is, Bob McChesney puts it, a leading media reformer in the United States. Great journalism leads to better and more accountable governments, a healthier economy, more attention to important social issues. But if market forces downgrade and corrupt journalism, it will produce an ignorant citizenry with resultant corruption and misery. Okay, so we've got positive and negative externalities. A third economic concept we could use is that of public goods. That is, materials or benefits that cannot be excluded effectively from use by consumers who do not pay for them, and can be used by one person without reducing their availability to another. And a great example of that would be streetlights, right? You couldn't operate a streetlight system on the basis of, say, a coin-operated input, right? Because you have to be able to see, for one thing, to put the coin in the first place. So that's why public services like, fire protection or streetlights have always been financed through taxation. And why is that important to the media? Because the more a good or service has public good attributes, the more there is a need for the government to play a role in creating policies to encourage the production of that good and to share the expense fairly, in paraphrasing from Bob McChesney. Examples in the media system would include over-the-air broadcasting, much of the ideas and content of the internet, and news and journalism all have aspects of being a public good. I can watch a TV show without depriving others of the ability to do so. And when it comes to journalism, that's why it's generally been subsidized by advertising, as in the United States, or public money, as in much of Western Europe, rather than always through direct consumer purchases. So to conclude, for economic activities that are public goods and have powerful positive externalities, it may not be possible for people to use the marketplace to express their desires for goods or services. Even people who don't use the service may be willing to pay for it through taxes to make sure that it exists, because they recognize its importance to democracy and society. And frankly, that's how I personally feel about community media. I don't necessarily watch a great deal of it. Here's a confession, I hardly listen to radio at all myself, but I'm very happy to have part of my cable fees and or my taxes go towards supporting this sector because of its importance to our whole society and our democracy. The market purchases are not the only or even the best way necessarily to express our values. And I think we need to make these kinds of arguments about market failure forcefully. These are terms that I think policymakers would readily understand. Make these arguments before community media policy itself becomes a train wreck. Okay, so thank you. I think are we set up now, Chris, to be able to hear? Before we turn to Professor Points.
Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, yes, we can.
Excellent.
Coming through loud and clear.
You bet. We got you.
Okay.
Oh, sorry. That one. That one? Yeah. No, you can turn that one. Go to your profile.
This is not this is,
Slideshow.
no. This is Daniel's. Mine's on the desktop.
Okay. So just minimize, yeah. So minimize there too.
Close this. Can I close
Sure.
this? This. Okay, thank you all. And thank you to those in Ottawa, to Bob for a very kind introduction. And I want to thank my class for being here because I'm not sure actually what this is like for you to be sitting in this moment of presence and non-presence at the same time. But thanks all for being here and for sticking this out as we figure out technology problems and other sorts of things. At any rate, so as Bob said, my name's Stuart Points, and for a very long time, I've been interested in community media and youth media production and how youth media production operates in cities to change the way that cities and culture are engaged today, how they're working, and the way these kinds of organizations shape urban space. I think when we ask questions about community media's role in relationship to democracy, something that's very important to think about in these terms is how community media itself is changing. I think what's happened over the last number of years is that community media is served by a whole range of organizations that come from what we might call a sector of the social economy. And a sector of that social economy includes many, many nonprofit organizations that are not strictly speaking just working in traditional definitions of community media, but include art projects, include projects that broadly have to do with the risk conditions that are part of how urban lives operate today. And particularly for young people, those risk conditions come in many shapes and forms. We've seen over this period, I would argue since certainly the early 2000s, a real proliferation in a rich ecology of production efforts, production projects. Maker spaces is a language that we hear more and more, that are broadly about trying to fortify and thicken up the way media located in community spaces in cities can shape a democratic urban culture. And I think in many ways, these organizations and their contributions to cities operate under the radar. And so over the last 4 or 5 years, a group of us in Vancouver have been trying to capture a sense of how these youth digital media ecologies operate so that you can have a flavor for how they're shaping urban space in new ways and confronting forces like gentrification, which have been powerful and significant forces in cities like Vancouver and Toronto in particular. Media in its digital forms and particularly in the use of video in all kinds of ways has been taken up as fundamental forces for helping young people to find themselves on a public stage in a way that can allow them to respond to the forces that are shaping their lives. That's what I want to talk about with you today. I want to tie these developments as well in with the whole idea of a media reform movement. I think the media reform movement has a rich tradition in Canada and is at the same time a really unstable mixture of practices and ambitions. Where we think of the role of media reform and media democratization in relation to youth media production, that's a really checkered and uncertain kind of relationship. And there's a number of reasons for that. Youth media production and media education have had a kind of tangled and complicated history for at least 3 reasons. On the one hand, the whole idea of bringing politicized media projects into classrooms and learning spaces is a challenge for teacher educators on a number of fronts, not the least of which is that teacher educators are under immense pressure to deliver on testing outcomes and other kinds of instrumentalized outcomes, which limit their ability to bring politics into the classroom. At the same time, the rich array of personalized communication technologies in young people's lives has produced an ambiguous set of outcomes around public engagement. And this complicates how projects of media education might be knit to projects of democratization. And then finally, the overwhelming pressure to instrumentalize media learning, to turn it into a kind of job training program, as well as has also complicated the relationship between youth media production and media democratization. if that's a backdrop and something that activists and organizers and cultural workers have been dealing with for a long time, it's also the case, I think, that young people and media politics, if you like, have been energized by a set of developments that are happening and are shifting how we think of community media in fundamental and interesting ways. On the one hand, these youth politics, we might say, have been fueled by old divides around race, around questions of Aboriginality, for instance, in Canada, the whole question of Aboriginal communities and the use of digital media to nurture the Idle No More movement, to draw attention to the murdered and missing women in Canada, has been a fundamental front of how localized media has been purposed for larger political ends. Around the world, we've seen a range of bottom-up youth actions in places like Turkey, in Israel, in the UK, in Quebec, in Spain, that have challenged the way that young people are thought of as political actors in cities. And this has really vitalized, I think, an effort to think of local community media practices as having a powerful relationship with democracy. And finally, in some ways, in a more mundane sense, a whole range of participatory media practices have emerged on the scene in the last decade or so that link together the ability to create and circulate and collaborate and connect peer-to-peer communities, youth communities in novel ways, has fueled a range of practices that are tied to some very interesting kinds of political acts. And I put some on the screen for people to think about. The Harry Potter Alliance is one that gets called up in this context. New forms of participatory storytelling, forms of campaign petitioning by organizations like Open Media and Change.org, and the use of meme politics to challenge public figure and authorities have allowed young people to participate and enact a kind of politics in cities that have shifted how we think of localized politics changing democracy. In Canada, we've been mapping out how spaces of institutionally located youth media projects have been part of this emergence of participatory media ecologies. This project is called the Youth Digital Media Ecologies in Canada project. And in that, we've been trying to map how in Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, a whole range of organizations and programs are shifting the way that community media is understood and democratic acts come to the surface. What we found in this project, and some of you may find the website more interesting on this front to take a look at, but what we found is that there's a range of groups that are part and parcel of these youth digital media ecologies today. The number of groups I put on the screen is perhaps more than we imagine. The work that they do in a variety of sectors is richer than we sometimes imagine. The genres and media forms that they participate in include a range of documentary, photography, website design, PSAs, etc. A number of genres that are taken up by organizations. As well, I should say, the number of youth that are touched, and maybe that's the most interesting dynamic that's part of youth digital media ecologies. In Vancouver, these organizations touch about 15,000 youth a year, which is approximately 17% of the Vancouver School Board's population. That's not an inconsequential amount. In Toronto, that number is about 50,000 youth a year, and in Montreal, it's about 50,000 youth a year. These are not inconsequential numbers, and it represents the way a kind of social economy of media production emerges in cities that often doesn't see itself as part of a larger project of community media production, but nonetheless, I would suggest is. These groups address a range of objectives, including empowerment, youth voice, and social change. I'll put that, this chart that we have on our website captures a sense of the kinds of objectives that organizations aim to achieve. They also reach a wide demographic of youth that crosses gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, citizenship, and of course, class, issues of class. In fact, what might be most interesting about the youth digital media ecologies in Canadian cities is that they're often involved in bringing young people into cities. What we've seen in the last 15 years is a process of gentrification that's moved some of the most vulnerable populations outside of our cities, to the margins, to the suburbs or exurbs of cities. Whereas youth digital media groups operate most often inside cities, they're involved with bringing young people into urban space in ways that young people who are from marginal communities can sometimes feel excluded. And in this way, they're actually quite literally providing a stage and a destination, a hub for young people to arrive on and to become part of. The demographics that these organizations touch, the number of young people they touch, as well as the range of media that they produce, speak to the role of difference and the role of a kind of vernacular cosmopolitanism in the work that youth media organizations are doing. In fact, I would argue today that what makes these organizations most interesting is not that they share a common politics. It's not that they share a common set of objectives. It's that collectively what they manage to do is produce a space and a set of conditions where cultural friction, edge conditions, arrives in cities and is the way that young people see themselves as encountering cities, stories, images, bodies in urban space. That cultural friction runs up against stories of lifestyle in cities, stories of gentrification in cities, and in this way offers a kind of outside or marginal practice which adds to the vernacular cosmopolitanism that operates in our urban environments. That vernacular cosmopolitanism, I want to argue, is a rich and fertile soil from which a media reform movement does grow, is growing. There are stories to be told in Vancouver about how these organizations have fed our own media democracy movement, the way that participants in youth media organizations have become speakers and actors in media democracy movements. And I think in this way, a rethinking of how community media operates as part of a social economy in a third sector that feeds a rich cultural friction in cities is an important way to understand how democracy is enriched by a space and a set of actions that often fly below the radar in thinking about how our urban communities operate today. Thanks. Bob's telling me that my time is done and I am done. So that couldn't have been a better time. I want to thank you. And I'm going to pass things over to Daniela Hadi, who I will let change our PowerPoint. We're all sitting without actually recognizing each other. We're talking to each other, but not receiving each other.
All right. Well, hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us. So my research, as Bob mentioned, broadly speaking, looks at diasporic communities and their media infrastructure. But more specifically, in my dissertation research, I've been looking at Iranian media in Stockholm, Sweden. And in this presentation, I'll be looking at the role Swedish media policy has played in terms of fostering community media infrastructure for the diasporic communities in that country. I like to start with a story from my fieldwork in Stockholm that I think nicely sums up the role community media can play in terms of mobilizing communities in any given geographical region. On April 13, 2011, at approximately 10:45 a.m., a woman calls the studio of Radio Ava, which is an Iranian local radio station in Stockholm. It's during the community bulletin segment of the program, during which listeners call to announce community events, advertise for sale of goods and services, or announce that they are seeking employment. The caller's voice is clearly laced with panic and urgency. She tells the radio host, Mr. Irani, that on her other phone line, she's talking to an Iranian man named Reza, who had been detained by the Swedish police the night before and now is waiting deportation at the Falun detention center. This is a detention center about 250 kilometers north of Stockholm. And it's become notorious as a sort of final stop for refugees who are facing deportation. So when you say that someone has been sent to Falun, that means that within days the person will be deported, essentially, from Sweden. So the host tells the woman to give him Reza's cell phone number off the air so he can call him. This way Reza would avoid hefty cell phone charges. He puts the scheduled program on hold and asks listeners to not call him, to not call into the studio so that Reza could tell his story without any interruption. The story of Reza is typical for many other illegal refugees who have been living in Sweden anywhere between a few months up to 10 years without proper documentation or legal status. He had fled Iran as a political activist, and after spending some time in Holland, he had finally made his way to Sweden and sought political asylum. After several appeal processes, his case was finally rejected, and he was sent to Falun for deportation. The host tries to comfort Reza and tells him that he will get in touch with the director of the Iranian Refugee Federation, Ms. Sara Nakai, to see what kind of support her organization could provide. And within minutes, Ms. Nakai calls the radio station and tells the host that she is at work and has no access to the radio, but one of her friends who was listening to the program had called her and said that she's been urged to call into the radio station. So Ms. Nakai announces that later that afternoon there would be a rally in support for Reza outside the Ministry of Immigration in Stockholm. This campaign for Reza lasted for about 3 months and included daily rallies outside the ministry, the Falun Detention Center, and the Swedish Parliament, as well as petitions and letters to the Swedish immigration officials. And close to the day of my departure, I heard on the radio that he had been released and granted asylum in Sweden. The campaign that has started with a simple telephone call from a concerned citizen to a local radio station had turned into a mobilization campaign of the Iranian community in Stockholm. And radio played a decisive role as the connecting node. It not only facilitated communication, but the host of the radio show played an active role as reporter and activist in an effort to bring attention to the cause of many refugees and asylum seekers in Sweden. And this is, for me, this exemplified the power of local ethnic media in Stockholm. It was a moment of epiphany for me. Up until that time, I was puzzled by the fact that radio still played such an important role in the lives of Iranians in Stockholm. Despite the internet, despite transnational satellite television programs, community radio continued to play a central role in the communication infrastructure of Iranians in Sweden. This panel is about policy, and I will talk about policies that govern ethnic media at global, regional, and national levels. Although for the sake of time, I will skip the global and regional and carry on with my discussion of national level policymaking and its role for fostering a vibrant ethnic communication infrastructure. But just briefly, in terms of the literature on ethnic media, if you're not familiar with that and what categorizes as ethnic media, Brown has a fairly decent list in terms of what constitutes or what role ethnic media play for diaspora communities. He argues that ethnic media rescue the language, they increase self-esteem, they combat negative images, they work for greater cohesiveness, and through this for political influence. They provide a visible and audible symbol for the ethnic society, and they provide an outlet for creative production, and finally provide a source for employment for immigrant population. So as I said, the paranational policy framework, I'm not going to get into that, but essentially both UNESCO and European Union have a number of policy directives that give voice to the importance of community media, and more specifically, ethnically diverse community media landscape. So in this presentation, I will mostly focus on the national policy framework. Hallin and Mancini categorization of the Swedish media system as democratic corporatist paints an overly idealized view of media in Sweden. As argued by Rosengren and later on by Weibull and Johnson, the Swedish media system started to experience a process of increasing market control in the early 1990s. with passing of legislation that allowed advertising in media. Warning us of an increasing commercialized media landscape, Rosengren wrote in 1994, quote, "In terms of the great wheel of culture in society, the economic and technological systems have more to say about the structure of media system, while the normative, expressive, and cognitive systems such as religion and the polity, art, and literature have experienced a corresponding decreasing influence. Newspapers are less closely tied to political parties and popular movements than previously. The great publishing houses have grown more market-oriented. Radio, once a great cultural, religious, and political educator of national importance, to a large extent has become a medium for testing and launching hit music and or for local small talks and advertisements." End of quote. To some degree, it is this shift to market influence that provided an opportunity for a vibrant ethnic media sector to grow in Sweden, parallel to a rather limited public service ethnic media programming. So what is the history of community media broadcasting? And I will mainly focus on the role of radio in this case. And how does it operate today? Unofficially, the practice of community media dates back to 1979, when voluntary associations were allowed to broadcast within limited geographical areas and with no advertising allowed. In 1986, after a test period of about 8 years, the government added the right to broadcast community radio clause to the radio and TV law. According to Article 12, Section 4 of this law, community radio means local sound radio transmission for association activities. The program must be locally produced, and the reach should be limited to 5 kilometers in range, although expansion of range are allowed under special provisions. Contrary to the public service broadcasting stations, community radio stations in Sweden are not subject to the rules of objectivity. Broadcasting licenses are usually valid for 5 years, unless specified differently, and a license to transmit community radio may only be given to the following persons or organizations. So local nonprofit associations, parishes within Church of Sweden, association of students at universities and colleges, and associations of several license holder in the transmission area for common community radio purposes. And in terms of the criteria for licensing, it's based on the following criteria. So first of all, a broadcast area for community radio encompasses at most one municipality, but the agency can decide on a wider broadcast area if there is an exceptional reason. When assessing whether a nonprofit organization or religious group has ties to the broadcast area, the authority takes into account where the studio and the premises for the activities are located, and the appointed publisher and board members are living, and the annual general meetings and board meetings are held. The biggest change to the radio and TV law since 1986 was the introduction of legislation in 1993 to allow advertising in community radios. And this change in policy resulted in a surge in the numbers of community radio in Sweden. According to a state-sponsored annual study of the Swedish media landscape, in 2004, there were 1,167 associations with license to broadcast community radio. Out of these, 261 associations were considered ethnic organizations. So what does this mean in actual media practices and the strengthening and continued relevance of local media in ethnic communities? So as I said, my research is on Iranian community radio in Stockholm. This is an inventory of the number of ethnic Iranian media that exist in Stockholm. So you see there are about 20 radio shows locally produced in Farsi in Stockholm. And most of them are daily programs. On average, they have about 3 hours of programming a day, each of these. So you can imagine that this goes on sort of 24/7. And they have about 6 FM frequencies at their disposal. And in terms of the role they play, just to give you a quick sort of a summary of it, I've sort of summed it up into these sort of 5 or 6 goals. First of all, they play an educational role. They also play a decisive role in terms of community building and fostering a sense of belonging and identity to the community. They play a role in terms of bridging home and host societies. And going back to my example at the start of my talk, they play a significant role in terms of fostering civic literacy and political participation. And finally, they play the role of intercultural ambassadors, bridging Iranian communities with various other ethnic communities in Stockholm. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Hello, and thanks to everyone for being here. My name is David Christopher. I'm the communications manager at Open Media. We're a digital rights organization headquartered here in Vancouver, and we basically work to ensure.
We can't see you on the screen. Do you have a PowerPoint or?
No, I don't have a PowerPoint. It's just a. Oh. It's not Skype, is it? No. Oh. Network. There we go. Can you see me now?
No.
This one, sorry. Oh, yeah. Oh, there we go.
Oh, there we go. Got it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Magic. So yeah, I was saying, Open Media, we work to ensure people can build a more connected and collaborative world through an internet that's open and accessible to everyone. We do this by trying to build really a global community. We started here in Canada, but we've expanded around the world, who care about the internet, and then connecting those people together to share their ideas. So we engage internet users in collaborative campaigns. We educate our community about key digital rights issues, and we also empower people by opening government processes to public input and scrutiny, and by crowdsourcing policy plans. I think in all of this, we strive to really utilize participatory and community-led processes, modeling the framework that should guide our government and even commercial decision-making. We believe that by modeling participatory processes and empowering the voices of everyday internet users, we can help show the way toward a more connected Canada and a brighter digital future for us all. So today we're gathered to discuss community media, what it looks like and how we can support it in the 21st century. But I think before we get into that, we should start by addressing a question. Why does democracy need community media? Now, the great scholar of communication, Robert McChesney, offered the following observation. He said, regardless of what a progressive group's first issue of importance is, its second issue should be media and communication, because so long as the media is in corporate hands, the task of social change will be vastly more difficult, if not impossible, across the board. Now, I think our work at Open Media focuses largely on safeguarding the possibilities of the open internet as a platform to challenge the narratives of entrenched interests. And it's clear that community media is an equally critical intervention needed to reshape the terrain of debate and ensure that the full diversity of Canada is represented in our media system. To borrow language from Professor Bob Hackett, community media is in this sense crucial to both democracy of the media as well as democracy through the media, the latter providing information to inform the citizenry on matters of collective decision making. I guess all this is why a number of years ago, back in 2009, 2010, Open Media worked with groups like the Canadian Association of Community Television Users and Stations, or Cactus, in their fight to reimagine and reinvigorate community media. Together with many of the thought leaders participating in this conference today, we developed an online campaign that helped deliver nearly 3,000 submissions to the CRTC, calling for the community media funds to be liberated from the big cable companies. Now, unfortunately, at that time, the CRTC ultimately decided to leave the over $100 million community media trust in the hands of the big cable companies. But today, the groups and individuals convened here have a unique opportunity to help undo this. We can reimagine community media and policy support for it in the interest of the cultural creator community, innovators, marginalized people, and Canadians in the broadest sense, rather than just a small handful of unaccountable, vertically integrated cable companies. When we last had this debate in 2009-10, Open Media was overwhelmed with what many other experts and commentators saw as the digital revolution that was then transforming everyday citizens into media producers. With the advent of the internet, the means of production and distribution became much more affordable and decentralized. And this new media environment really invited the question of what does community media look like in the 21st century, and what should it look like? I think when it comes to the corporate media, it's no secret that media ownership in Canada is more concentrated than ever before. We owe a huge debt to the Canadian Media Concentration Research Project, led by Professor Drain Winsek at Carleton University, who has greatly helped our understanding of this problem. Now, this intensifying media concentration on the one hand stands in stark contrast to the internet, ostensibly the most participatory medium in history. All you need these days is a decent computer with a good internet connection, and that really gives all of us the power to become media producers with at least a potential to reach significant audiences. But for many, we're still missing a key piece, which is access to media literacy, knowledge, and production skills. That's why we've been pushing, many groups have been pushing for this concept of community media centers in the 21st century, spaces that are dedicated to creating an open platform for all kinds of citizen collaborations. They could be modeled after recreation centers, local libraries. They would provide training, equipment, possibly even acquiring broadcast languages for radio or TV. They could offer facilities for recording and podcasting and video production and web design and web streaming, and share resources among other community organizations like community newspapers, libraries, and theaters that also specialize in communications. Going forward, these community media centers could really, I think, push our understanding of media and innovation even further, beginning to resemble modern maker labs or hacker spaces. Technologies like 3D printers and 3D scanners could give patrons access to experiences that are otherwise unimaginable. Similarly, if we provide public access to the next generation of high-speed internet, like the gigabit speed internet currently being offered by the Chattanooga Library's public library system in Tennessee, that could provide incredible opportunities for innovation, experimentation, and learning, and also will be particularly valuable here in Canada, where fewer than 5% of us currently have access to fibre. That's a quarter of the OECD average. So I think there's no doubt that these types of community centres could revolutionise media education and training, and leverage the full potential of the open internet, and I think contributing perhaps toward what Professor Points was saying earlier about a democratic urban culture. So just the other question posed in the title of our panel is, why does community media need policy support? And I think the answer is because right now we're clearly a very long way away from the type of community media that we've just been sketching out together. There are a number of systematic barriers that are slowing this process down. I think in order to support culture in a digital environment, we really need to liberate the community media trust from the big cable companies and ensure it is distributed to local media innovation centers. Until now, the telecom giants have basically been using this public trust for their own commercial interests. So the types of, just to give a specific example, the kind of type of skill training and access to facilities that you can imagine in the community media center model simply isn't happening under the current model. Cactus's Cathy Edwards pointed out in a piece published in Rabble that the joke is that for more than a decade, the CRTC has continued to mandate cable companies to support community television, but more than 90% of these channels have closed, and yet they're continuing to spend all your money on increasingly professionalized community channels in big cities. There are now fewer than 20 distinct program schedules or channels left in the whole country. The content made at the big centers like in Ottawa, Toronto, and Halifax and Vancouver are then being piped back out over huge regional cable networks with perhaps just the occasional insertion of a local council meeting to serve a particular area. So, you know, the on-the-ground impacts of that kind of policy, they're working for the big telecom companies, but they're leaving an awful lot of Canadians left unreached and on the wrong side of the digital skills divide. But right now, you know, the CRTC's community media policy simply isn't actually helping communities. It ensures instead a top-down paternalistic approach that places the big telecom companies rather than communities in the driver's seat of what community media should look like. And the time for this approach has passed. We really need a radical bottom-up approach to community media that allows it to be driven by the needs of citizen media makers. And that's why I think the type of community media centers being proposed by Cactus are so important. So I'll just wrap up very quickly now. I think if we liberate these public funds from the pockets of the cable monopolies, we could have a whole ecosystem of independent community media centers across the country that would act as incubators for job creation, empowerment, skills-based learning, and media innovation. For Open Media's part, we're going to continue working for an internet that safeguards free expression, that's affordable and surveillance-free. We'll also continue to demand greater engagement, transparency, and accountability from the CRTC in the hope that this will help struggles to improve our whole communication system across Canada. Thank you.
Hi, everyone here in Vancouver, and hello in Ottawa. I'm the caboose of this presentation, and my talk is going to try to link some of these local and national issues to the international context. And I couldn't have asked for a better segue than this last presentation. I want to start by talking about what has been happening with international development in Canada over the last several decades. When international development work was formalized in Canada in 1968 with the establishment of CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, Canada took a really novel approach to thinking about how we could interact with the rest of the world. The idea was that there would indeed be funding that went to international development and humanitarian aid work, but a portion of the federal budget would also go to establishing a civil society or policy community within Canada. And this was very important to the governments of the time, which were Lester B. Pearson's government and then Trudeau Sr.'s government. They really felt that if they were going to pursue international work in this way, they needed to establish a basis of social justice thinking within Canada. Canadians needed to be educated about international issues, and they also needed to take on roles as members of this policy community. And they saw this as a way of establishing an attitude of what is called humane internationalism among Canadians. This was the idea that Canada saw helping people elsewhere in the world in terms of altruism. And this also butted up against the idea of liberal internationalism, which is the idea that by creating a friendly international community, Canada can help itself. So, we're a small country. We like to leverage our international connections the best way we can. So in order to punch above our weight on the international stage, we needed to have friends out there. So between those two things, trying to form friendships and also being altruistic, there needed to be that grassroots supports among Canadians for this type of work. And the way that CETA did this was by rolling out a huge public engagement strategy. They funded public engagement through schools, they established programs in universities, they funded Canadian NGOs who would in turn do public engagement work in communities, they funded the establishment of research institutes who would also do public engagement in communities, and etc. Now, what we have seen in the last several decades in Canada is a gradual erosion in this public engagement work. And this has been as a result of a series of factors. Of course, neoliberalism in general, the push for efficiency and effectiveness through neoliberalism and new public management has forced people to be very pragmatic about their approaches to public engagement in Canada. And this applies in the international development sector as well. Changes in mediation, a gradual move away from engagement about these issues in classroom settings or in community settings towards mass media and then the internet. Thirdly, Harperism, the last decade has been particularly damaging. There's been, of course, a villainization of charities, the reorganization of CETA. CETA was moved into the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development. The move to reframe development work also in terms of Canadian prosperity and security. So Harper tried to change the narrative around our international commitments from one of altruism, humane internationalism, to one of anything we do on the international stage should promote Canadian prosperity and security first and primarily. And that includes any type of development work. And then finally, this has been affected by a deepening split between humanitarian and development work in Canada. So the Harper government in particular tended to prioritize humanitarian work over development work. And the way that the Harper government prioritized humanitarian work caused the formation of something called Humanitarian Coalition. And this is a group that composes CARE, Oxfam Quebec, Plan, and Save the Children. And I can go into this in more detail later, but this is a group that exists to raise money, period, and send money abroad. This is what they do. And that is very different from organizations that do community-based work in Canada, connect Canadian communities to communities abroad, this sort of work. Overall, the effect of this gradual shift in public engagement has been a shift from transformative work, working with people to help them think about how they want to engage these issues, to transactional work. In other words, let me send you an email and ask you to donate to my cause. And I will try to convince you to do that, and that will be the transaction that will take place between the two of us. This has resulted in a wider set of problems, and I wish I didn't have to order these 1, 2, 3. They're really interrelated. Starting with the fact that we have seen a gradual erosion in spaces for public engagement in Canada, and this is where this really starts to link with democracy. I love a work by Nick Coldry on this, and he talks about how people can't engage in issues when they don't find that there's a space that makes those issues real and realizable. People will try, and when they find that they engage and nothing happens, that there's no immediate impact, they stop, because we're quite logical in how we spend our time on these sorts of things. And Coldry argues that you need to establish real, effective spaces of change making in which people can engage. And if you don't have those, then people will withdraw from public society. And so we've seen that with international development or international issues. People have withdrawn because they don't see that when they voice that there's an effective kind of change happening. And we see this in statistics, polls that are done with Canadians. Canadians over and over again say, international issues are important, we are charitable, but the federal government should solve these issues. We're not going to donate money to international issues. We aren't involved in international issues. The federal government should solve this. So there's a true disconnect there. This in turn, and we see this all the time in the Canadian stage, causes a simplification of how people deal with these issues. That transactionalism, that lack of effective spaces for discussion, causes people to greatly simplify international issues and people who they see on the international scene. They want to send money to solve the problem. They want to drop bombs to solve the problem. So there's this very simplistic notion of how Canadian citizens connect with these international issues. And this is what really drives me nuts about this, is that it creates a space where it's very easy for political parties to lead us by our noses. And so we see with Harper a deliberate and well-documented effort to reorient Canadian attitudes towards international issues away from humane internationalism, away from liberal internationalism, and towards realist internationalism, because Harper saw this as a way of creating conservatism as a natural home in Canada. And so that breakdown in those effective spaces of public engagement has effects for our democracy and how we connect with Canadian attitudes and Canadian policymaking. We can see this playing out in the way that television in Canada engages with these two issues. I'm going to give two quick examples because I'm sure I'm running out of time by now. One of them is on that humanitarian front. If you go to Humanitarian Coalition's website, they have a list of their supporting partners, and those include Shaw and Rogers. What do? Shaw and Rogers support the Humanitarian Coalition by providing free advertising in times of crisis. So you will see announcements for, hurricane in the Philippines or earthquake in Haiti, send money now. It goes to these partners. And that advertising is provided for free by these big TV networks. But of course, that's contributing to this transactional relationship that Canadians have with these issues. And then the other example I want to give, and this is where the introduction of the community TV situation in Canada is useful, is that when you look at that programming, you discover that community television programming in Canada defines community in a very specific way. Community is this kind of parochial concept as it's represented in this programming. You get things like, in Edmonton, a program called Road to Hope, the Human Side to Urgent Social Issues. But this is very narrowly defined as on-the-street social issues in Edmonton. And those issues are only in the context of Edmonton. It's very charitable vision. And they are not connected in any way to larger social issues, either regionally, nationally, or internationally. So it's this very parochial approach to community. I could go into that in more depth, but I'll leave it for now. Where does this leave us in terms of policy around these issues? I think that we are in a moment, and I suspect that's why this conference is happening, where there could be opportunities to rethink this. We have, of course, a new government, but more importantly, from my perspective, we have a new international framework for thinking about these issues. The United Nations has just approved the Sustainable Development Goals, which will replace the Millennium Development Goals. And what's really exciting about the Sustainable Development Goals is that they adopt the principle of universality. No longer is development something that happens in the global south. For the UN now, everywhere is the global south. We are all suffering from climate change. We are all suffering from these things, and everybody has to rethink their approach to development everywhere. What does that mean for community media? I think when I think about it, I think that communities need to understand themselves as situated in these larger international contexts, for one thing. But at a more practical level, and they need to be given tools to report themselves in this way. But also at a practical level, I'm very interested in what's happening in Latin America with community media, which is really burgeoning there, where community media is establishing platforms for the sharing of local stories. So you get spaces, program spaces, but the content circulates between communities. So one community could be sharing what's happening in our community with climate change mitigation, what's happening in your community with climate change mitigation. With the current system in Canada, that doesn't happen. You get the Edmonton local TV, you get the Vancouver local TV, but very little sharing of content between them, and certainly nothing at the international scale. So I'll leave it at that. That's there, I'm exactly on time. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. To our presenters, to our audience here in Vancouver, to our folks in Ottawa. I think we have, well, actually, given our time that we had we used time to set up, we've probably got 15 minutes, 10 or 15 minutes for questions, etc. How does that sound, Alex?
This is Brett, and yes, we have 15 minutes. Yeah, maybe if we could keep it a bit under 15, that would be great.
Sure.
More like 12.
12. We've got 12. Excellent. Okay, that's fine. So the floor is open, and I think we thought, Brett, that the questions would originally at least come from Ottawa, but we've opened the floor here in Vancouver as well to members of our audience. So anybody on either side of this digital line would like to begin, that'd be great.
We've got one here. There's a mic over there if you want to, if you don't mind. And let us know if you can hear the questions
Indeed.
when they come. One sec.
No problem. Kind of thought he was.
Hi, it's Trish Elliott from the U of R. Good to see you all.
Can you hear?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great. I just wanted to have a question for Catherine. The link between the CETA-funded public engagement and the development of community media on the prairies is something I've actually kind of studied and looked into. It was a very clear link in Saskatchewan with the development education centers that were funded by CETA, providing content, providing advertising, but also the pathway to rural and northern Saskatchewan and making those links. Those organizations are all gone now, with the exception of SCIC. I have a sense that those are links that need to be rebuilt, but in the absence of organizations like QSO or Oxfam having regional offices out here anymore, or out in the prairies, what sort of natural links can you see helping out to bring these two groups together? Thank you.
So absolutely. I have also become acquainted with that history. And unfortunately, those linkages were really damaged and they are being rebuilt. The Canadian Council for International Cooperation and the Inter-Council Network they have provincial bodies. So here in BC, it's BCCIC, there's the Alberta Council, Manitoba Council, Ontario, Quebec Maritimes, and Northern Councils. And they are really working on a shoestring to try to do what they can to support local organizations in their public engagement efforts. But unfortunately, given that gap that I described, where people expect the federal government to pay for international development work, it makes it very difficult for local organizations to have funding unless they get it directly from the government. And unless they have funding, they can't engage in that type of community building work. So they end up using internet also in a very transactional way instead of a transformative way. So it's a real Gordian knot. It's a real problem how to resolve this. I think that one of my hopes is that these types of community media centers will try to envision themselves in a broader way. So not just as a reflection of the immediate community, but as a meeting space for all of the service organizations in a community that are trying to figure out how to create those spaces of public engagement that are so important for linking with policy, and not just local policy, but also building attitudes around international issues, that sort of thing. And I think that would be a good avenue. And anyway, if we're moving towards these sustainable development goals, that's the way it has to be, because development is happening everywhere, not somewhere else in the world. So we need to be thinking about our development, and we need to be thinking about our development as it relates to the development elsewhere on the planet. And that is a community issue.
Thanks. That's great, Catherine. Brett?
Yeah.
Are there any questions here or any others from your end?
If you have one in Vancouver, we can take it first.
Anybody?
Or we've got another one lined up here.
Great.
Okay,
Let's go from Ottawa then, yeah?
you're up.
Hi, I'm Deepak Sahasrabudhe, and I know Stuart and Catherine from New Westminster. I live in New Westminster, BC, and I conducted a study of 87 license areas across Canada to examine what did community television look like in those 87 communities, 87 license areas actually. And the takeaway I have from looking at more than 2,100 programs broadcast in almost 30,000 slots across Canada for 1 week, is that mostly the corporate community television service doesn't really get what access is supposed to be. What I found was programming that is pretty much expedient programming that fits the rules in some cases. Overall, I found 17% compliance, and of course the balance is the big exception is in access programming. So I'm interested in how can we change this?
Well, I think there's probably a number of arguments. I mean, let me say, Deepak, that I would want to say in part, I think what we've heard on the panel this morning is that the corporatization of community media in Canada, community television in Canada, has fit in with the conclusions you found from your close encounter with programming, such that the narrowing of the kinds of representational space that operates on community media has really been central to the way Rogers and Shaw and other big telcos have taken control of that space and really undermined the role community media has as a third pillar of the broadcasting system, something Bob mentioned at the outset. For these reasons, I would want to suggest to you that the kinds of community media centers David noted, the kinds of media organizations that operate through art galleries, community centers, and other kinds of organizations that I drew attention to are, I think, resources that both represent and suggest a model of how community media work could bring back, could resurface a tradition of broader, plural forms of media practice that bring together communities in a much more diverse way that I think the community TV community itself would benefit from alliances with, would benefit from drawing connections with on a policy level. I think that these kinds of alliances would allow a set of actions to challenge how the telcos have really taken control of the community media space in the country.
I have a thought on this too. I had a really talented MA student last year complete a thesis on community radio in Ecuador. And she said that people kept, when she read the literature on these topics, people kept saying, communities need a voice, communities need a voice. We need to find a way to give communities a voice. And she said this was absolutely untrue. Communities have a voice and they are voicing their community all the time. They are expressing themselves as a community all the time, which is, I think, what Stuart was really saying in his presentation, that communities have a voice and they are expressing themselves. But we need to figure out how community media works to accompany community rather than how community expresses itself through media. And so that means that the Community Media Center becomes a space where communities come together, that community goes out and accompanies the production of community.
Could I just add, I think, Deepak, your question does reinforce the need for a broad-based media reform movement, right? It's simply well beyond simply community media practitioners and audiences, as important though they be. And that's part of the purpose that we hold the annual Media Democracy Day here in Vancouver every year. And Trish Elliott has organized with her colleagues one in Regina. And I think that's a spreading movement. And I think that there is now more opportunities with a new government to put these kinds of issues on the agenda and get policy, because that's what this whole panel is arguing. We need policy support to build genuinely independent community media. I guess we got a couple of minutes left, do we?
We have a couple of minutes left, I think. Is there perhaps one more question we might take, Brett?
Yep, we can take another question. Do you have one there, or?
Yes, my name is Pedro Mora from Victoria, and I was wondering when we talk about, and I'm from Ecuador, by the way, too. You were talking about the media in Ecuador. The reform that has to come from CRTC regulation, I've been thinking is not to limit community access producers to the cable companies, but to include government-operated outlets like TVO and Knowledge Network and CBC. They could have a slot of 4 hours or 6 hours a week or something to local producers to have their message out too. Do you think that CRTC should make that kind of regulation?
Hello, Pedro. It's David here. Yeah, I mean, I think both your question and the previous question really just highlights what's wrong with the current system, and I think the whole idea that you can expect that these massive private telecom conglomerates can be entrusted with the future of community media is just it doesn't make sense, because these are companies that are geared toward making a profit. The whole incentive structure of incentives for them isn't what's required if we are to, I think, democratize and open up community media in this country. I guess one note of optimism, though, you know, it was 5 years since the previous CRTC decision on that. In that intervening time, we have seen increasing evidence that the CRTC is finally starting to listen to the public interest a bit more, rather than just listening to what the big telecom companies are saying. So it could be that there's a more receptive climate at the CRTC now for the kind of reforms that are needed.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Brett, I think we're at 20 after, or just close to, perhaps I'm a little fast here, but I think we're going to wrap up at this end.
That sounds great. Okay. Thank you so much for all of your contributions, and hopefully you could hear us clapping.
We can, actually. In fact, what would be lovely is if there's any way to see your audience, because it's such a strange experience to be talking about community media but have no sense of the population that's involved.
Sir,
is there any way that
you want to see
we
the
can
audience?
see you?
Oh, yeah. Let me just turn the computer.
Wow. Well, we say hello to you. And we thank you all for being part of this.
Thank you. Okay. Have a nice day.
Yeah, indeed. Okay, let's.